70s, we had a little transmitter that was about the size of a box of matches. Now, people probably don't even know what the hell that is anymore.
Yeah.
But it was called a T4. You could have 2 channels on it. And they were specialized. They were not encrypted channels because we had yet to go to encrypted channels, but we had special frequencies, right? And they were high band 800 hertz series. So they were fairly short distance, but they were also something that the citizens couldn't really get a hold of. I say that's not entirely true, right? But we had that equipment, and we also had a thing called a Nagra tape recorder that was about this size, and it was actually reel to reel, 2 small reels. And it had twin mics that you would put right about here on a chest and wrap them in cotton. And those would pick up sounds. If you listened to it later on headphones, it was as though you were present. And all of that worked down from government channels up above. Oddly enough, the Nagra recorders were used for many years by Hollywood to get that really perfect sound that you often hear.
Yeah. Wow.
But the surveillance techniques have gotten way more far advanced. I mean, we used to be concerned that the Soviets would put a laser up against an office window, and in so doing, the minute vibrations of a keyboard could be translated into the actual text of what was being typed. So there are strategies and techniques that are available for surveillance today, I'm sure. I mean, if I were doing it, which I'm not today, but I would send a drone in there and I'd put 2 or 3 cameras, with independent batteries looking into the house. You could do that today. Whereas in my era, you'd have to run hardwire to do that sort of thing. And by the way, that wasn't above us. What was known as CCTV camera looking into the kitchen or the rooms if we had authorization to do so, or it was for national security. Foreign counterintelligence operations in the FBI are not subject to the same rules and regulations that are for civilians.
What kind of things could they have been doing with Bryan Kohberger that we don't know about?
Well, I mean, look, one of the things, and of course the Bureau denied this, is you're following a guy all the way across the country. You're bound to lose him.
They did lose him, according to sources.
Well, I hear that, and then I hear them deny it. But you're bound to, right? So how do you solve that problem? And you solve that problem with what we saw, whisper stop, right? Now, whisper stop doesn't anticipate that there'll be another actual stop by police on the highway. So you end up with 2 stops. That seems kind of odd. But only one of them was a whisper stop where an agent or somebody involved in the actual transit contacted them. This is the car. We think it's on I-4 or whatever the hell it is. And that brings me another memory. When I was an agent, if I left my house and I had to go to Tallahassee, I had to put down the car I was in, who I was with, the ETA for various intersections that I would cross going to Tallahassee, because otherwise the FBI didn't have a way to get in touch with me when I was needed. So it was really exacting.
Yeah.
So clearly the Bureau has connections with all law enforcement. And when we have a thing called the National Academy, where we bring individuals who are really good cops to the academy and give them additional training and things like that. So there's a relationship. Hell, I used to have a relationship with Bob Brotherton, who was the police chief in Hong Kong. So those are the kind of relationships that you have. And those relationships can be used to make a car stop that car, see who the hell's in it. Now, because of body cameras today, right, they were able to see things later that were helpful to them. For example, was he wounded? There's some speculation that he was wounded while he was driving back with his father in the car. Plus, you want to know that you got the right car and that it is who you think it is, right?
Yeah.
Because if you screw that up, they won't get fired, but they're certainly not going to be very happy at headquarters with you for losing them.
No, I think that's really interesting. Did you go through the list of the items that they seized from his house?
I did. And
And
let me tell you the most interesting one that I saw, and people don't really know this. I taught death investigations for the FBI for a number of years, along with other major courses related to a variety of things. And one of the things I taught was Ted Bundy. You know, who was he? How do we figure that out, right? And Ted Bundy, when he was arrested, we ultimately seized a whole bunch of materials. He would sit down in front of a mirror and he would sketch himself while he was in disguise. Okay, he would sketch himself. So he often used a cast, and I have this memory of in my mind of seeing all these slides that I had produced that I used to teach. And I can remember he would have his cast like this. And of course, he didn't have an injury. It was a fake cast. And he would have a mask on and he would draw himself, you know, and he was a fairly not good artist, but a decent drawer. So he could draw himself really effectively. When they raided Kohberger's place, they found hand-drawn images.
They did.
And it occurs to me that he would have known of Bundy, may have had access to the same materials that I used for teaching, because he was in that behavior, right?
Yeah.
And may have seen that Bundy did that and emulated that. I mean, that'd be fascinating, but it just doesn't describe the hand-drawn sketches.
There are certainly a lot of I would say overlap between Bundy, between the BTK killer, between Elliot Rodger, if you're familiar with Elliot Rodger, who's the father of the incel movement, is sort of the way that they describe him, or the founder of the incel movement. So there are some definite clue pieces that either we're just stretching and we're trying to make something out of nothing, or like you said, he was a student of serial killers and he may have either advertently or inadvertently allowed it to get deep in him.
Well, we also know that he asked in his search for a doctorate, he was asking individuals how they felt when they committed crimes and getting into the specifics of that sort of thing. So that's not a far leap to drawing an image of yourself when you're in costume.
Right.
So I think all of these individuals who are predatory and they're not only, but they're parasites too.
Yeah.
You know, and so the consequence is that they have similar behavioral characteristics.
Yeah.
The problem is, unless you know somebody really, really well, you'll never see those characteristics.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating to me that if you interview a killer, a child killer, a sexual child killer, one of the ways that have been very successful in getting them to confess is for the investigator to pretend to be themselves interested in child pornography, as an example. Okay.
I see.
So you're behaving as though they're behaving, and they are reaching out because they would love to find somebody who has a similar desire for criminal behavior in order, right, to participate with them. That's the art of communication, really. And so there's little doubt in my mind that these people behave in similar ways. And they certainly, look, I knew early on, and I talked with Nancy Grace about this. I said, you're going to find a sniper's hide.
Yeah.
You know, they think that's something you wear, like a ghillie suit, right? No. A sniper's hide is where you hide up behind the house and you look at somebody's windows that are open or not well covered for a period of time. And sure enough, we know based on telemetry that he was there for at least 12 times, right?
Yeah.
And so in my mind, it's clear he was watching these people. And I did a brief video on the dangers that particularly young women encounter when they don't recognize the danger of open displays of themselves to the outside.
Mm-hmm.
Because men are very visually driven, women
Mm-hmm.
not so much. I mean, I got involved in an interesting conversation with Nancy Grace and some others, and when I was teaching these courses, I learned a funny thing. If you ever went into a magazine store, which there are not many of those left anymore, but there used to be a plethora of magazine stores in any city you'd go into. Typically, they were divided. They were divided into two sides. You had the women's side and the men's side. And if you walked in the men's side, you would see in cellophane, you would
Mm-hmm.
see girly magazines, right? Playboy and others, just, and they were in plastic so that
Mm-hmm.
you couldn't peruse them, right? Okay. On the other side, there were women's magazines. Do you have any idea what women's magazines were in cellophane?
I have no idea. Romance novel type,
Nope.
Reader's Digest. I have no idea.
Nope. Wedding magazines.
Oh,
And there, my friend, is the difference between the two sexes. Right
right.
there. Men are interested in the way women look and appear and that sort of thing. And women are interested in a relationship because they bear the largest responsibility for reproduction, right?
Right.
I mean, they're going to be with the child for 9 months, and then the child isn't on their own. So they really have to bear. And that's why I think it's really important for women to be careful what they display of themselves, because they put themselves at risk to individuals who are potentially not off the rails. They're off the rails, the individuals, and you can't see them. And we've dealt with instances where somebody would climb a 30-foot tree to look in a window. Well, that's not something a woman's going to do, right? That's something a young guy's going to do. So I think we have to warn people about those potential dangers. Earlier society did 30 years ago, not so much today.
Very fascinating. Are you familiar with Elliot Rodger and the incel? I know we've talked about incel last time you're on here, but there was an interesting discovery that we came across on Elliot Rodger's manifesto, which is page 118, is the page I went and read inside of it, considering there was page 118 underlined. So I'm just racking my brain. What could he have possibly underlined on page 118? And he just talks about how because women wouldn't sleep with him, they deserve to die. And any man that was sleeping with the beautiful women, they deserve to die too. And he said it needed to happen on November 2013, which is interesting considering this was November 13th when this took place. So I'm not saying it's a stretch again, but there's a lot of things I think we look at Elliot Rodger and what took place there, and then with Bryan Kohberger and the idea of an incel.
I'm not really familiar with that individual with whom you spoke. I'm familiar with the incel movement.
Yeah,
I'm certainly aware that it's a complexity. I mean, the population of Japan has started to decline steadily.
right.
The
China
reproduction,
too.
right, well, it's a problem, and it's a problem in part because one of the biggest weapons, and that's not the right word, the biggest skill set that a woman has is to just look at a man and deem him not acceptable.
Right. It's a superpower.
It is. It's a superpower. And young men just can't absorb that. And I think that's unfortunate because we need to have personal relationships, and we need that. We shouldn't be living in a virtual world. I mean, there's a real world out there, and it's got to be better than a virtual world. But we see increasingly the incels are into the virtual world. And when you have things like GChat and iChat and where you can communicate with an artificial intelligence, when that manifests itself in the way of a silicon sister that is also mechanical,
Right.
you're going to have a real crisis on your hands.
A big crisis.
I
Yeah.
think. I think.
No, I've been studying this. There's a guy that actually posts a video every single day where he's been talking about the declining population in certain countries, especially countries that we've relied on for certain things, and how that's going to really impact the global structure and the global system. China's on the other end of it. Japan's on the other end of it. And the United States would also be on the other end of it, by the way, if they didn't allow immigration in the way that they do. And I'm not talking about the ones that are coming illegally. I'm just saying we have a great immigration policy that bolsters our population and continues to see an increase in it. However, with the key demographics that they're looking at, natural born United States citizens, there's a decrease as well. So there's a decrease across the board in all major nations.
Well, it's interesting. Let me mention, I used to have an abattoir. I'm sorry, an apiary. I didn't have an abattoir, but I had an apiary. So I raised bees for a long time. And you don't know this, but perhaps, maybe you do. But if somebody sets up any number of beehives next to your beehives, and there are a more substantial number of beehives next to your beehives will be robbed. In other words, your bees will leave,
Yeah,
and the other bees will come and get the honey that those bees left. Okay? You know, the United States is like all those beehives next to the other countries.
yeah,
And everybody wants to come to America. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
right.
The key here is we want people who are hard, industrious workers who believe in the same principles that we do in the Constitution. I mean, they should be welcomed with open arms because that's how we get our talent. I mean, look at Elon Musk.
Exactly.
And the left really doesn't like him now. The right has embraced him. It's switched back and forth over the decades.
5 years ago was the opposite. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's amazing to me what brilliance that individual has. And there are others.
And he's an immigrant. And I always felt like, just from my own observations, the more diversity that exists often leads to the greatest breakthroughs in innovation. And so I'm totally on board with you in that.
Well, let me be clear about my idea of diversity. In my world, if you're just picking diversity based on the obvious, right?
Right. I agree with you on that. Yeah.
You know, if you're just on that basis, the entire system declines. Because if you're working in an organization, you want the very best people in that organization. Exactly. I have that here in my law office. Now I have a variety. There's a diversity here, believe me. But I can tell you that they're the top of their effort, field, and skill sets. So, and I create a working environment that's pleasurable for them. They basically run their own cases. They show up when they want to. They don't have a boss hanging over their neck saying, "Where are you? And what the hell have you been doing? Why weren't you doing this?" Because that's insulting, right?
Yeah.
People do what they're going to do, and I praise them when they do well. So that behavior doesn't exist in typical industry, in my experience. In fact, it's just the opposite. You have people standing on you to get higher.
It's true.
And so I think that we want a diversity because we want a diversity of ideas and opinions, but we don't want a diversity just based on some list that some idiot has created and said, this is the list that'll make the world a better place, because that's not true, in my view.
Why do you think so many people like Bryan Kohberger find faith while they're in prison?
Oh, you know, Jesus lives in the jail, right?
Well, that is a true statement from my perspective.
No, wait, he does. There used to be an old jail here in Jacksonville. And if you were to go into that jail, which was, by the way, on Liberty Street, okay? If you went into the jail, it was dark and dank, and there were plaster walls, okay? It was not tile. as it is often today, plaster walls. And I have seen some of the most spectacular renderings of the Christ that you've ever seen in your life, painted on those walls inside the jail cells. And it's only tongue in cheek that I say Jesus is in the jail, but while they're there, there's only one potential hope for them, and that's it.
Yeah. It's
and
true.
So everybody seems to, I'm praying with God, and what I think a true Christian recognizes is the Roman coin, right? Right? You pay to Caesar what's Caesar's. And if you do a crime, you're going to be paying in this lifetime and to this society. Now, God may have forgiven you, and you may be saved, and you may go on to live eternally. Certainly, that's my hope for myself and the people I love. But I can tell you that you're going to pay your piper here.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's good. That's really good. I think sometimes, from my perspective, as somebody who watches these kinds of things closely, it feels like some of them do it as a way to sway the jury. And
no question. No question.
Yeah.
And I guess if you're innocent, truly innocent, which, by the way, none of us are truly innocent.
Yeah, true.
I decry the fact that, and I have people say this, well, the police can search anything I've got because I don't have anything to hide. That's not true for any of us. And it's the government. It'd be one thing for God to search your soul, but it's another thing for you. You got to recognize that the government has no soul. They have no morality. They are a system, an organized system. And that system, when it interfaces with you, can destroy you without even intending to.
Yeah.
We used to break down doors in houses to search them. Do you think we ever repaired that door? That we had a carpenter with us who would come up and say, hey, sorry, let me fix this? No.
I had that thought about Bryan Kohberger's door with duct tape shut after they were done there. I was like, I wonder if his dad's now having to fix that.
I worry that here's another worry I have about law enforcement related to Murdoch and Kohberger and even Bundy. We don't do the basic searches for evidence that we used to do. We have all this fancy technology, the phone cameras, and all that stuff now, right? But we don't do the simple stuff, like a good physical search, plaster casting of shoe impressions. People don't even know what the hell that is anymore.
Yeah.
And that takes time for the investigator, and the investigator is going to get dirty. And today we've done this weird thing. When I was an agent, we did everything. There wasn't an aspect of the case that we were involved in that we weren't personally doing. Sort of like handmade shoes, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we did everything. Today, it's not that way. We have an ID technician, right, who shows up in the van, and they perform the actual survey for evidence. And then there may be somebody else who actually photographs the evidence, and somebody else who does other aspects of the collection and preservation and all that. What you have there is a thing called deniability, right?
Yeah.
But if you're the only person in charge of it and you didn't do it, where's the deniability? It's just you, right? And so I think in many ways things were better back in the earlier times when we did what I consider more thorough physical searches and investigations. We didn't rely on the technologies we do today. And we do absolutely rely on it today.
We 100% do. In fact, I think that's going to be some of the biggest pieces of evidence they're going to try to use against Bryan Kohberger. Another thing that I wanted to get your take on was, because I've heard conflicting reports about this. So the items that they took from his house, some people have said that they just take everything. Other people have said they're only taking things that they think are connected to the case, possibly.
Well,
Which is it?
you take everything. I mean, I know agents who and we used to have phone booths. I don't know whether you ever remember those, but there were coin that you put a phone in and you actually dial the number. Originally, it was a rotary phone, and then there were buttons you'd push dial and you put money. We loaded up the entire phone booth, unhooked it, unbolted it from the ground, and sent it to the laboratory. Right?
Can you extract data off of it?
Well, you can't screw that up, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if there's any hairs or fibers or there's any DNA, today DNA, and back then it was fingerprints. If there was anything, they could manage it. And you didn't get jammed up with not doing it exactly as the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. would have done it. The point is, you tended to be very thorough when you're the lightning bolt connection to the problem, right? And I don't see that today. One of the interesting things is in the Murdaugh matter, when the police showed up and they thought, no doubt, initially, he was Alex Murdaugh was the killer, no doubt. They had that in their mind. But you certainly set up a perimeter. Yeah. And what's the first thing you do? You call for dogs, right?
Yeah.
And you search the perimeter. Why wouldn't you do that?
Right.
And so those are the more, as I said, those are the more traditional investigative techniques. And I think we've discarded those to our own discredit.
No, I agree with that totally. We have a question coming in from one of our listeners, Deborah. She says, what do you think about the attorneys having a conflict of interest? Obviously talking about Ann Taylor, who's representing Bryan Kohberger, had at her office at least represented Xander Kernodle's mom at one point.
What conflict of interest is? First off, conflict of interest is something that relates to the individual case.
Yeah.
Okay. So her earlier representation of a mother has no connection with what's going on here. So that doesn't really exist. And, conflict can also be waived. Every client that I represent is entitled to conflict-free representation. Okay. But I often have, if two family members are charged with the same event and they both want me to represent them, I have them sign waivers of conflict. So it can be waived.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think there's any bias that would go into this. Certainly, the attorney doesn't know anything about the mom that would have created some sort of problem with one of the victims. Now, if the problem with the mother was dealt with specifically one of the victims, then maybe there could a conflict exist. If that attorney learned something about the victim that she knows because of the mother, then there could be a potential conflict, but I doubt that's the case.
Well, she immediately recused herself from any level of involvement with the mom, so I could see why that would exist that way. So that's interesting, really interesting perspective. Bryan Kohberger was asked by the judge directly if he was okay with her representing him still. Right. And he said, yes, he's fine with it. Actually, he says it's his wish that she represents him.
Why do you think that is?
Other than she's a bulldog, it seems like from my perspective, she was on the scene. She's been gathering evidence. I don't know. I was surprised from a couple different perspectives that he wanted her, but maybe he thinks he'll get sympathy because she's a woman. I don't know. You tell me.
That's my thought. Your last statement is sort of my thought. I mean, here's a woman. He is apparently a misogynist based on his prior conduct when he was back home. So, that's going to be an interesting dynamic to see how that plays out.
What are the biggest pieces of evidence you think against Bryan Kohberger at this point? And then as a criminal defense attorney, how would you slice and dice them to make them not issues?
So those are the real secrets, right?
Yeah.
Well, to begin with, let me mention something to you. All right. And just as an example, okay, I represented a guy and he liked to steal women's pocketbooks and take their checks and cash them. Okay. That was his modus operandi, right? His MO. And so he hired me, and he got out of jail, and he started his mechanism of living, of course, was this mechanism that he developed, right?
Right. Yeah.
So
His MO.
he went right back to it, right? Only now he had an ankle monitor on. So every car that was broken into, pocketbook, checkbook stolen, they could map him being there because of the ankle monitor, right? So the way I successfully represented him, right, is I want to see the ankle monitor and I need the telemetry. Well, guess what? They returned the ankle monitor when they arrested him, right? I didn't have that anymore. And the telemetry was never preserved because it's not used for that purpose.
Right.
So the government couldn't prove what they wanted to prove. So those are the points here that allow somebody to get around, because you might think, hearing what the story that I just told you, that he was guilty and that information would clearly be admissible in court.
Right. Yeah, I did. I would have. Yeah.
Yeah, right. But if you're not, as a prosecutor, thinking properly, how am I going to present this information? Okay. Then that's how we're able to successfully defend clients. They couldn't really prove, they wanted to be able to prove that he was there when these other burglaries occurred, but they couldn't do it. And there are other examples of failure by law enforcement to behave in a manner that allows the evidence collected to come to court. But in particular with Kohberger now, the things that, and I just opined that he was at the property 12 times. Well, the only way I know that is because of telemetry, which is triangulation with electronic pulses that mysteriously go through the atmosphere. And as we all know, that tower may pick me up, but this one's so busy that another one has to pick me up. And so how does triangulation really work?
Yeah.
And with a mathematician, you would argue that all this triangulation to show specifically where he was at what time, absent video, is just garbage. It's just a bunch of smoke and mirrors. You can't really prove it. And so that's the attack has to be made. And it's a problem today because electronic technology, particularly videos, seem to just overwhelm us. We are a generation, many generations, of watching TV and believing everything we see on TV as being the truth. But if you take different camera angles from the same thing, which you're not doing typically with videos from Ring cameras and the kinds of things we have today, you may find an entirely different story. People who look like they're together might entirely be different.
It's true.
Altogether. But we've yet to have protocols for understanding how cameras should work and film should work and what it really means, because it's dangerous. As soon as they are able to reproduce a counterfeit film of you behaving improperly, even though that's never happened, okay? And they disseminate that, it won't be long before everybody believes what they see on camera, despite the fact that it's absolutely untrue.
Well, that technology exists in this moment.
Well,
I could take
it does, but not at a level that it can't be uncovered.
I see.
And that's the problem with AI.
Yeah.
Artificial intelligence can make that happen in a way that you're not going to know the truth. Interestingly, when I used to handle domestic cases, it was always a request to catch the individual cheating on the other spouse, right? It was always that request. And it was not because they wanted to do something with it. It's because they wanted to know for an absolute certain fact that what they believed
Yeah.
was true, despite their spouse's constant denial.
Yeah.
They want, you want to know the truth. And I think we all, although we can't always handle the truth, I mean, the truth can injure you.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some truths that you'd be better off not knowing.
It's like, you can't handle the truth. Yeah, that's true sometimes.
Well, no, I think it really is true. It can hurt the way you feel about a spouse or somebody who's close to you, or my grandmother. I read years later after my father died that he had written in a diary. He said, "My mom thinks that my son is ugly, but we don't think so." So there's the grandmother that I loved, okay, telling my father when I was born back in the 50s that she, as the queen grandmother, didn't think I was good looking. So, that was a fact that I could have done without.
Right. I would have not. It sounded like what you're saying, though, is that the biggest piece of evidence they're going to use against Bryan Kohberger is going to be the cell phone data. And then you sort of went through the way that you would dismantle that.
Well, yes. And then you have the automobile, okay? You have the automobile. And remember, he doesn't have to provide any testimony. He doesn't have to provide any whatever. But if they find on the gas pedal and the brake pedal or in the seatbelt retractor DNA or blood or anything, a hair or fiber from one of those children that died, he's going to get convicted. Okay. Yeah. So the second most important piece of evidence is that car. Now, they took their time with that, right? They did the right thing. I was always sort of amazed that they didn't take all the cars away from the property right now. Okay.
Yeah, me too.
The ones that were the girls owned or the decedents owned, and take them away and store them. And they just kept them in the damn weather. That's not something the Bureau would do. We would operate more like NCIS, where you put them in an area to keep them in the right humidity and those kind of things, because there are methods of extracting evidence, fingerprint, blood, hairs and fibers, those sorts of things from automobiles that get destroyed in the weather. So you don't want that. But they did a good job. They got a search warrant for the car. The police officers who initially found the car, in the other learning institution, that was all good police work.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the car is the other important thing. And then it would never surprise me. They also found a hotel room key.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, and they go to that hotel room, they get a warrant for that and search it for anything that might be there. And it's not unusual for people. Well, I mean, you can look behind me. I mean, there's a cat I found, right? Yeah, there it is right there.
I like that cat.
Yeah, I do too. And that's why I have it here. And some lanterns, some books, picture of my dad. These are important possessions of mine. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here.
Right.
They're not just for you to see. They're to remind me of who I am and where I come from.
Yeah.
And they're stored in a special place. There's alarms and locks and et cetera to protect this stuff.
Yeah.
My point is, it would not be unusual for Kohberger to have had a place where he stored that stuff on campus.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're in a doctorate program, you have a carrel that you only use.
Yeah.
And in fact, in some cases, you have a room that only you use. So my hope is that these people who've conducted these investigations understand that and will search those areas for specific things. In my years, things were written on paper, diaries and documents. That is absolutely untrue of today's youth.
It's true.
Store everything right here.
People.
And I'm just telling you, those computers that they've seized, the phone that they've seized, all of those things are going to be critical to this continued prosecution. No question about it.
I couldn't believe how many computers Bryan Kohberger had at his house.
Oh, I've got 4 or 5 right here that I progressed out of. I haven't erased. I don't know why. I probably got half a dozen cell phones, that I need to just take a hammer to, like Hillary did, and get rid of the information. But I don't want to do that. I might have some use for them. They cost me money.
Yeah, I know. I'm that same way. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. And I will give you the final words if there's anything else you want to add about this case.
Well, I think that it's instructive, the case itself, because what I notice about courtrooms today, when I do trial cases, they're empty. There's no public in the courtrooms watching what goes on. Years ago, of course, the windows would be up on the courthouse in the courtroom, and people would have picnics outside and listen to their justice system in operation. It was a holiday.
Yeah.
And the public is interested in the process any longer. Those of us who are directly involved in it are, but I submit to you that these kinds of cases and the ability of cameras to be in the courtrooms is helping bring that awareness of what a trial is really about and how much effort we go through to get a proper prosecution and a successful conviction when somebody truly is guilty.
I totally agree. I think it 100% helps the American justice system by allowing cameras in the courtroom and for the public to participate in that way.